If we examine the German governments, we find that as a result of the circumstances of the time, the situation in Germany, the standpoint of German education, and finally their own happy instincts, they are driven to combine the civilized defects of the modern political world, whose advantages we lack, with the barbaric defeats of the ancien regime, of which we have our full measure. In this way, Germany must participate more and more, if not in the reason, then at least in the unreason, even of those state forms which have progressed beyond its status quo. For example, is there any country in the world who shares as naively as so-called constitutional Germany all the illusions of the constitutional state without sharing any of its realities? Or was it just an accident that the idea of combining the torments of censorship with the torments of the French September laws, which presupposed freedom of the press, was the invention of the German government? Just as the gods of all nations could be found in the Roman pantheon, so the sins of all state forms will be found in the Holy Roman German Empire. That this eclecticism will take of unheard of proportions is assured in particular by the politico-aesthetic gourmandise of a German king, Frederick William the Fourth. That this eclecticism will take in unheard of proportions is assured in particular by the politico-aesthetic gourmandise of a German king, who proposes to play all the roles of royalty, feudal and bureaucratic, absolute and constitutional, autocratic and democratic, if not in the person of the people, then at least in his own person, and if not for the people, then at least for himself. Germany, as a world of its own embodying all the deficiencies of the present political age, will not be able to overcome the specifically German limitations without overcoming the universal limitation of the present political age. It is not radical revolution or universal human emancipation, which is a utopian dream for Germany. It is the partial, merely political revolution, the revolution which leaves the pillars of the building standing. What is the basis of a partial and merely political revolution? Its basis is the fact that one part of civil society emancipates itself and attains universal domination, that one particular class undertakes from its particular situation the universal emancipation of society. This class liberates the whole of society, but only on conditions that the whole of society finds itself in the same situation as this class. Ergo, possesses or can easily acquire money and education. No class of civil society can play this role without awakening a moment of enthusiasm in itself and in the masses, a moment in which this class fraternizes and infuses with society in general, becomes identified with it, and is experienced and acknowledged in its universal representative, a moment in which its claims and rights are truly the rights and claims of society itself, and in which it is in reality the heart and head of society. Only in the name of universal rights of society can a particular class lay claim to universal domination. Revolutionary energy and spiritual self-confidence are not enough to storm this position of liberator and to ensure, therefore, the political exploitation of all the other spheres of society in the interests of one's own sphere. If the revolution of a people and the emancipation of a particular class of civil society are to coincide, if one class is to stand for the whole of society, then all the deficiencies of society must be concentrated in another class. One particular class must be the class which gives universal offense, the embodiment of a general limitation. One particular sphere of society must appear as the notorious crime of the whole of society, so that the liberation of this sphere appears as universal self-liberation. If one class is to be the class of liberation par excellence, then another class must be the class of overt oppression. This negative general significance of the French nobility and the French clergy determined the positive general significance of the class which stood nearest to and opposed to them. the bourgeoisie. But in Germany, every particular class lacks not only the consistency, acuteness, courage, and ruthlessness which would stamp it as the negative representative of society equally, all classes lack that breadth of spirit which identifies itself, if only for a moment, with the spirit of the people, that genius which can raise material force to the level of political power, that revolutionary boldness which flings into the face of its adversary the defiant words, "I am nothing, and I should be everything." The main feature of German mortality, the main feature of German morality and honor, not only in individuals but in classes, is that modest egoism which asserts its narrowness and allows that narrowness to be used against it. The relationship of the different spheres of German society is therefore epic rather than dramatic. Each begins to experience itself and to set up camp alongside the others with its own particular claims, not as soon as it is oppressed, but as soon as circumstances, without any contribution from the sphere concerned, create an inferior social stratum Each begins to experience itself and to set up camp alongside the others with its particular claims, not as soon as it is oppressed, but as soon as circumstances, without any contribution from the sphere concerned, create an inferior social stratum, which it in its turn can oppress. Even the moral self-confidence of the German middle class is based simply on an awareness of being the general representative of the Philistine mediocrity of all the other classes. It is therefore not only the German kings which mount the throne mal apropos, but every sphere of civil society which experiences defeat before it celebrates victory, develops its own limitations before it overcomes the limitations confronting it, and asserts its narrow-mindedness before it has had a chance to assert its generosity. As a result, even the opportunity of playing a great role has always passed by before it was ever really available, and every class, as soon as it takes up the struggle against the class above it, is involved in a struggle with the class beneath it. Thus princes struggle against kings, bureaucrats against aristocrats, and bourgeoisie against all of these, while the proletariat is already beginning to struggle against the bourgeoisie. The middle class scarcely dares to conceive of the idea of emancipation from its own point of view, and already the development of social conditions and the progress of political theory have demonstrated this point of view to be antiquated, or at least problematic. In France, it is enough to be something for one to want to be everything. In Germany, no way may be anything unless... In France, it is enough to be something for one to want to be everything. In Germany, no one may be anything unless he renounces everything. In France, partial emancipation is the basis of universal emancipation. In Germany, universal emancipation is the conditio sine qua non of any partial emancipation. In France, it is the reality. In Germany, the impossibility of emancipation in stages that must give birth to complete freedom. In France, each class of the people is a political idealist and experiences itself first and foremost not as a particular class, but as the representative of social needs in general. The role of emancipator therefore passes in a dramatic movement from one class of the French people to the next, until it finally reaches that class which no longer realizes social freedom by assuming certain conditions external to man and created by human society, but rather by organizing all the conditions of human existence on the basis of social freedom. If Germany, however, where practical life is as devoid of intellect as intellectual life is of practical activity, no class of civil society has the need and the capacity for universal emancipation unless under the compulsion of its immediate situation, of material necessity, and of its chains themselves. But where is the positive possibility of German emancipation? This is our answer. In the formation of a class with radical chains, a class of civil society which is not a class of civil society, a class which is the dissolution of all classes, A sphere which has a universal character because of its universal suffering, and which lays claim to no particular right because the wrong it suffers is not a particular wrong, but wrong in general. A sphere of society which can no longer claim to be a historical title, but merely to a human one, which does not stand in one-sided opposition to the consequences, but in all-sided opposition to the premises of the German political system. And finally, a sphere which cannot emancipate itself without emancipating itself from, and therefore emancipating, all the other spheres of society, which is, in a word, the total loss of humanity, and which can therefore redeem itself only through the total redemption of humanity. This dissolution of society as a particular class is the proletariat. The proletariat is only beginning to appear in Germany as a result of the emergent industrial movement. For the proletariat is not formed by natural poverty, but by artificially produced poverty. It is formed not from the mass of people mechanically oppressed by the weight of society, but from the mass of people issuing from society's acute disintegration, and in particular from the dissolution of the middle class. Clearly, however, the ranks of the proletariat are also gradually swelled by natural poverty and Christian Germanic serfdom. When the proletariat claims the dissolution of the existing world order, it is only declaring the secret of its own existence, for it is the actual dissolution of that order. When the proletariat demands the negation of private property, it is only elevating to a principle for society what society has already made a principle for the proletariat, what is embodied in the proletariat without its consent as the negative result of society. The proletarian then finds that he has the same right in relation to the world which is coming into being as the German king in relation to the world as it is at present when he calls the people his people, just as he calls his horse his horse. By calling the people his private property, the king is merely declaring that the owner of private property is king. Just as philosophy finds its material weapons in the proletariat, so the proletariat finds its intellectual weapons in philosophy. And once the lightning of thought has struck deeply into this virgin soil of the people, emancipation will transform the Germans into men. Let us sum up the result. The only liberation of Germany which is practically possible is liberation from the point of view of that theory which declares man to be the supreme being for man. Germany can emancipate itself for the Middle Ages only if it emancipates itself at the same time from the partial victories over the Middle Ages. In Germany, no form of bondage can be broken without breaking all forms of bondage. Germany, which is renowned for its thoroughness, cannot make a revolution unless it is a thorough one. The emancipation of the German is the emancipation of man. The head of this emancipation is philosophy, its heart, the proletariat. Philosophy cannot realize itself without the transcendence of the proletariat, and the proletariat cannot transcend itself without the realization of philosophy. When all the inner conditions are met, the day of the German resurrection will be heralded by the crowning of the Gallic cock. That's fucking obscure. Anybody want a Wikipedia of the Gallic cock? I do.